So last week Aubrey spoke about origin, morality, meaning and destiny. And those are critical questions to understand. And today we're going to deal with origin, but we're going to deal specifically with first light. But we're going to draw quite a strange analogy. And there is going to be a prize for somebody today as well. So we're going to look at baking a cake, and there's a slice of Elaine's wonderful homemade chocolate cake, which is to die for the person that can answer a question correctly at the end of the session. So I'll just say this now. Remember Romans 1:20. We'll cover that off. The bakers here will know when you're baking a cake or when you're baking anything, what you actually need. And I think Jan maybe more so than anybody being a true baker. So with that, we've got the ingredients. And there's a whole long list of ingredients. And within this chocolate cake, you've got the actual cake itself and you've got the icing. Now, if you go through that list of ingredients, there are two components to it. One is there's the specific product, so let's say it's white flour, and then there's a quantity, an amount that needs to be put into it. And we just think, well, we go to the cupboard and we grab a packet of flour and we empty it out into the correct measure. But we don't think of the journey that flour has taken to actually arrive in our cupboard. It's been grown on a farm somewhere, it's been harvested, it's gone to a processing plant, it's actually then been separated from the husk, it's then been ground down fine, and also it's been bleached most of the time. So there's a whole long process that goes through just to get to the flour that we so quickly go and grab out of the cupboard. Similarly with the icing, there's a range of components that go into the icing. But what also goes with that is that you need some equipment. You cannot bake a cake if you don't have the equipment. Now you've got the oven that has to have the ability to be set to a certain temperature. You've got the measuring tools, you've got the stirring, you've got the containers, you've got a whole range of things that actually need to go, that you need to use, and the temperature to be set at a specific level to bake a decent cake. And we've got a visitor here flying around the room. But most critically, you cannot bake a cake if you don't have a set of instructions, if you do not have a recipe. And that recipe has to be followed. And when it comes to baking, it's far more critical to follow the recipe than it is if you're making a stew. When you're making a stew, you can add a little bit of this and add a little bit of that. But when it comes to baking a cake, you need to know exactly what you're doing, the sequence that things are added to each other to actually deliver the final result that is worth eating. So bear that in mind. So this I see as an analogy for the creation of life. If we now look at what the atheist or the materialist view is of how first life was created, they would have you believe that there was a primordial soup, and let me just get there. Here we go. And that in this muddy pond, somewhere there was a lightning strike. There was a whole mix and a range of elements. I don't know how many of you remember your periodic table from school with all the elements in it, and that somehow with a bit of energy, with a bit of pressure, whether this was a vent down at the bottom of the ocean, all of those bits and pieces came together. They aggregated into molecules, they aggregated into bigger things, and somehow they then formed the first life. However, when we look at our view on it, the biblical view, we go to Genesis, and we can see that the first life in Genesis was described by God, let there be vegetation. And note in that, seed-bearing plants and trees in the land that bear fruit with seed. There was the ability to reproduce in the creation of life. A cake doesn't replicate itself automatically unless there's a person there doing it. And we also see then that that was the first life. Now, if we look at and we consider the sequence of creation, there was heaven and earth, then there was light, and there was day and night. Then we had the sky, then there was the separation of the water from the land. Because without the separation of water from the land, there would be no place for the vegetation to actually take hold and to grow. Not, there are some plants in the sea, but in terms of that. Then there were the seasons. And we know that there's the seasons in life where there's a dormant period where things need to recover. Certain evergreens, certain grow in winter, some grow in summer. There's a season that is required for vegetation. Then it was the creatures of the sea and the air. Then on land, and finally there was man. So first life was actually vegetation, and that vegetation was produced or created with the ability to reproduce. This process of new life is called abiogenesis. Abiogenesis, Genesis, beginning. Bio is life, and A means without. So abiogenesis as a concept means life from non-life. That is what abiogenesis in the scientific term means. So it's life from non-life. And we must consider that life is actually an extremely delicate, critical, intricate process. Because what you have is you have elements. Those elements aggregate together to form molecules. The molecules in turn make far more complex structures with each other. Then you have to have those molecules forming organelles or small little organs all within a cell. Then you've got to have the actual cell itself. That then has to have the ability to reproduce. And we're going to go into these in more detail. But the scientific and science perspective would be that there's a tin of Campbell's primordial soup that would then deliver this process. And science at this point in time, or the scientific method, has no idea whatsoever how first life came about. Even if you gave them the specific ingredients right now, they could not create life. They can tell you what is in a cell, but they cannot tell you how to actually make that cell. Notwithstanding what many of them will actually tell you, and what people say, that they, in fact, this is going back probably about 5 or 10 years, they were saying, we'll have life in 3 years' time, or life in 5 years' time. What seems to happen is that the more they understand on the complexities and the intricacies, the further away they actually get. Because the more you know, sometimes the more you realize you don't know. So what then is the best explanation? And what are the ingredients or the building blocks of our lives? And this is not a science lesson, but there'll be some science wrapped up in it. So please, you don't have to remember this, but just remember some of the basic concepts. So we made up largely of carbohydrates. So we think of pastas and rice, etc. But carbohydrates are critical components. Amino acids, nucleotides, and lipids, so fats. And I'll give a brief explanation. Then there's energy, and there's water. And so we need to have a particular acidity. We all know that lemons and oranges are acidic or alkaline. What is the actual pH of the medium in which life needs to be formed? But what is missing from all of this are the assembly instructions. Now, I'd say people like myself, I don't know how many other men are like that, but I certainly like leaving the assembly instructions in the cupboard and then try and put whatever I'm constructing together on my own, and then sadly you sometimes end up with a bunch of nuts and bolts in your hand which you don't know where they go, and then you have to go and revert to the instructions. It's a bit like asking for directions. We don't like asking for directions. So the assembly instructions for life are just absolutely essential, and we'll go into where those potentially come from. But first of all, there are 3 concepts and 1 big idea that I do need to actually get across. One is purity. The next is handedness. So we've all got 2 hands that are identical yet different, as well as electron spin. or efficiency. So those three, and then there's a final one that I'll address. So when it comes to purity, if you need to add water to the cake that you're baking or milk, it doesn't help that you've got it filled with mud. You can say you've got a glass of water, but there are so many impurities in there to be effectively useless. So we cannot go around and just drink water that we find in a muddy pond. It actually has to go through quite a significant number of processes to filter out all of those impurities. So when it comes to life, purity is absolutely essential. In fact, all of these are essential. We all like wearing gloves in winter when our hands get a bit chilly, but our hands are a mirror image of each other, but you cannot superimpose them on top of each other because then they're out of alignment. Now, molecules are the same. There are left-handed and right-handed molecules available. And the importance of that, we don't actually understand until you start digging into the science. Many of you might remember the dark days of the thalidomide tragedies. Thalidomide was a medication that was developed for ladies who were pregnant, which helped with morning sickness. However, there was a left-handed version of the molecule and a right-handed version of the molecule. And the one was fine and the other one caused all the defects. That is how critical it is to have the right-handedness when it comes to the molecules that make up our body. And that handedness has an impact in terms of the efficiency of our bodies. I'm not sure how many of you may have seen the movie Midnight Express. It was a bit of a strange movie, I had to admit, but there were these inmates in a prison. And part of their exercise was there was this circular area, and they would all walk around in the same direction, just follow each other mindlessly. And the main character of the film got put into this prison. And he decided, no, he was going to do it differently. He was going to walk in the opposite direction. And this created all sorts of chaos and friction and aggravation. Now, the spin of an electron is the same. If it does not spin all in the same direction, and you have some that are called backscattered, you end up with friction, and what results is a lot of heat. And our bodies would not survive if we did not have the right kind of spin in the molecules in our body. So we have got so many different aspects that are critical to making life out of the right molecules. The last thing that I want to get across now, before we just go into a little bit more of the information, is the scale of things. We have some idea of what a millionaire is, and many houses now are worth $1 million. Maybe some people have got $50 million. And then we start understanding, well, so-and-so is a billionaire, so-and-so is a multi-billionaire. But $1 billion is $1,000 million. And numbers start getting to the point where they're just a name. It's a trillion. It actually loses meaning for us. And the way they write these really, really large numbers, and Aubrey's used a Google before, but the number is written as 10 to a power. And so the number 10 to the 80 is the estimated number of particles in the universe, elemental particles. Now that's nothing that we can actually relate to, but I want you to remember that number, because when we look at something in a few moments' time, you can actually use that 10 to the 80 and try and put it into context of what we're actually dealing with here. The scale of things, the probability, and potentially the impossibility of something happening. Now, why are they actually in this present in PowerPoint chosen avocado for carbohydrates? I'm not quite sure, but there's certainly a lot of good things in an avocado. But carbohydrates, just to give you an example, are obviously sugars. We know them as simple sugars, and glucose is probably one of the most well-known ones. What you probably don't know is that it is extremely difficult to make carbohydrates in a laboratory. It is just extremely, extremely difficult. And so the organic chemists, they will have to go through process after process after process to ultimately end up with making a complex carbohydrate. Now, glucose is normally strung together. You have a glucose molecule, and it's strung together into a number of molecules. Just to string 6 glucose molecules together, the number of options that are available are 1 in a trillion. Because there are 5 different versions of glucose, believe it or not. We think of glucose as glucose, but there are 5 different versions. And so the chances of this all coming together in just the correct way is 1 in a trillion. Now, the US debt at the moment is about $34 trillion. It's a number that we cannot even think about, and their interest has now just gone to $1 trillion in interest alone. New Zealand's GDP doesn't come anywhere close, but it gives you an idea of the scale of things. Lipids or fats play a vital role in terms of the protection of our cell and a cell membrane. And I'm sure we've all heard of cholesterol. That's what gets mentioned everywhere in the news, etc. You got to keep your cholesterol under control. Well, cholesterol is actually a lipid, it's a fat. And it's also a hormone, it plays a hormonal role in your body, and it is essential to cell walls. Every single cell wall in your body, and especially in your brain, has got cholesterol in it. Yet we almost get to think about cholesterol as being a bad thing. Proteins are quite remarkable. Quite remarkable. So proteins are made up of a series of amino acids. And if you look at the top there, you've got like this little string of beads. And all those beads are just a number of amino acids. And when they're in a long string like that, they'll ultimately be called a protein. That's really what a protein is. But what happens is that as they aggregate and develop, they start forming into different shapes. And the shape is what is critical. If you have a puzzle, there are 2 components to a puzzle piece. One is there's the color and the design on it, and 2, there's the shape. So that puzzle piece goes into a very specific place with a very specific color. You can't just mix them around. There might be a number of the puzzle pieces which have got the same shape, but they've got a different picture on the front of them. Proteins are like that, only significantly more complex, because that is a 3-dimensional shape, and their function, what they actually do, is determined by the shape. So the protein is produced to go and do a particular piece of work, a little bit like you've got a spanner to go and loosen a bolt. That's what a protein does. It does all of these functions in your body. Now, if you have a single functional protein, and a functional protein has to be there to do a particular job, that has got 150 amino acids in its string, so call it 150 beads, which is a modest length for a protein. The chances of that forming naturally are 1 in 10 to the 164th. Now put that into context of the total number of elemental particles in the world. That is for 1 medium length protein molecule. So we have got how many proteins in our bodies performing a variety of tasks and functions. We're like the world's most phenomenal factory. We've got production facilities, we've got transport facilities, we've got energy creation. But probably even more amazing than that is call it the nucleotides, which we would know generally as DNA and RNA. Certainly we've heard too much about RNA in the past number of years. But just look at the remarkable nature of this, because DNA, whilst we all know the helix coil to it, is a bit like a zip. So there are two parts to it, and they dovetail with each other. And so the little strands there, those are known by their names, ATC, or their letters ATC and G. And what happens is that our DNA unzips for a section, and then the RNA comes out of that and is copied. So the letters are replicated into RNA, which is a single strand. So we've got this machine that actually produces the information that we need. And I think that this is probably the most vital component, is because the molecules in our body are literally on steroids. They're like the world's biggest army knife. They can do so many things, and they're so perfect. They're absolutely perfect for what is needed. But what's missing from all of this, the world's best ingredients are never going to deliver the best cake unless you have the set of instructions, unless you have the information to drive that. Now, Bill Gates and Richard Dawkins suggest that DNA is like some fantastic computer code. We've got our software developers we've got a simple calculator on one of our websites, and just to write the code for that simple calculator is 60 pages of A4 written full out. 64 pages, or 60 pages, A4 full. That is the amount of code just for a simple calculator. So imagine the amount of code that actually sits behind all the Microsoft products or the Google products, and imagine the level of code that is actually within our bodies. Because if we don't have that code, we've got this information which is stored inside us that not only serve us and maintain, but they enable us to reproduce. Now, a protein of 150 beads is 10 to the 164th. Can you imagine, when it comes to our DNA, we have got 6.2 billion letters. So they normally call them pairs. So 3.1 billion letters that have to be in the right sequence. It's a bit like the Bible. The Bible is written in a sequence. If we don't have the set of instructions correctly, it does not actually translate through properly into human life. So imagine what the chances are of that word, probably the longest word that God breathed into us, are 3.1 billion base pairs to deliver us who we are as human beings. And I'm going to give you an example here of a bacteria. Just a very, very simple example of a bacteria. And if you see those, on the right-hand side is actually the bacteria, and those filaments at the back are called flagellums, how they propel themselves through whatever medium they're in, through our bodies or through water. On the left-hand side, you see the construction detail of what goes to make up the motors of those propellers. Now this is all by random chance, that the detail in that is a motor. Long before we even understood what a motor was and how a motor might work, these were there. So let me wrap up with some summaries and conclusions. So the finest ingredients in the world are not going to deliver anything if you do not have the set of instructions that are required to actually make us perfectly the way we are. We're made in God's image, but we tend to think at one level, well, that is a physical image. No, we're made in God's image, in His Spirit. That is more important to remember than what we are, and His Spirit is contained with us. His Spirit is written on our hearts in our morality. And the chances in this universe of 10 to the 80 of creating just one protein, functional protein, 10 to the 164th, those numbers I find just don't make sense to me. Because not only is that to produce one protein, how many different organisms are there, from bacteria to viruses to birds to trees, the variety of everything that exists, the insects. Everything would need to go through this series of chances, probability, to come up with the right answer. So some of the questions that we might ask is, how does the scientific community explain first life? They have extreme difficulty in that. They will say, well, this got together with that, and they can create some basic ideas. So the left-handedness and the right-handedness, they can make that in a laboratory, but it's a mixture. We need purity. Amino acids, for example, are all left-handed. Carbohydrates are right-handed. How does that work? Because they cannot, the scientists cannot make that in a laboratory, that it is pure. The purity is critical. What are the building blocks of the left-handed and right-handed versions? Or why are they? Have they created life in a laboratory? There are many people that believe that life has actually been created in a laboratory. It just hasn't been. They're so far away. They have not come anywhere close to producing life in a laboratory. And then, how many particles are there in the universe? Just some broad things to think about. And what I have done in the sermon notes, I've put down a list of some of the apologists that I've followed over a period of time, with links to their websites, and you can go and see who they are, explore those which you might like. So Gary Habermas, if you're interested in the resurrection, he is scientifically researched, historically researched the resurrection. He is the foremost master on that. And there's some of them that deal with far more difficult challenges, like John Lennox will address the problem of evil, of natural evil, of man-made evil. So there's a list there that you can just go and click on the links. So for life to have begun in a muddy pool with random, uncontrolled environmental circumstances, from a set of elements that formed into the perfect molecules, and those molecules aggregated into complex structures, together to develop into organelles, with specific functions and roles, detailed information, within a contained structure that protects it and allows it to feed, as well as the ability to produce, in my view, would be impossible without an intelligent designer who is so far beyond our capacity to understand as to be called holy. Kodesh in Hebrew and Hagios in Greek, or simply God. And thanks, Chris, for this. Louis Pasteur said, little science takes you away from God. A lot takes you near to Him. And I think that is quite a remarkable statement. Now I said we're going to go to Romans, so let's revisit Romans 1:20. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, there's so much that we cannot see, both His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that we are without excuse. We need to go out there and look around at the magnificence of what our natural world is, and look at each other in the magnificence of what is within us and with each and every relationship. So bearing that in mind, that if you look and you will see and understand, there's now a quick test. And I'm going to ask you, I'm going to show an image in a moment, and I need you to count the number of triangles that there are in this image. And I'm only going to give you a second or two. It shouldn't take you particularly long. And then the person that answers correctly will, and it'll be my decision, final decision. How many triangles do you actually see here? And there'll be a piece of cake. As in so. All right, and I'll make this easy. I'm not going to ask you to stick up your hand, other than I'll start off and say, I'm going to count up. So how many of you said there were no triangles? How many of you said there was one triangle? Well, you're going to get the prize for being closest. For being closest. Because there are no triangles. Have a look at this. This is the illusion that we can create. Our mind fills in lines. And I think that this is what's happened with the scientific world. They've looked at things and they've said it's the illusion of design. No, it's not the illusion of design. We can easily fool ourselves, as I've just demonstrated to you, and I'll show you now. If I remove those three little Pac-Men, what do you have left? Just three angles. So the Pac-Men were just round circles, a slice or a cake with a slice taken out of it. So in terms of Romans, we need to look and see beyond what is the obvious to us, and realize that it's we can be quite easily fooled. So for being closest. So thank you. I hope I've given you some things to think about in terms of all of this. Remember that when we're having these conversations, they're actually all about grace and exploring a bit more in building relationships with people. But I take so much confidence from learning more about science and getting closer to God in this process. For me, it's just a wonderful, wonderful journey.